Assalamu alaikum, our dear viewers, and welcome once again to the Jalsa Salana of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community taking place here in the United Kingdom. We've talked about different topics, various interviews that you've seen live, behind the scenes, speeches that we've summarized, especially the speeches of His Holiness, the Supreme Head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We have a very interesting topic to discuss here today. We have with me Barrie Schwortz. He hardly needs any introduction. He's known worldwide, a very famous photographer, but he took a picture of a very famous thing that is of interest to many people around the world. Like I said, Barrie Schwortz is a professional photographer, but one special thing about him is that he took a picture of the first picture, if I'm right, of the Turin Shroud. And next to him on my far right is Arif Khan Sahib, who is a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He's a member of the Review of Religions, which is a magazine that was initiated and set up by the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community himself, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. May peace be upon him. So with my two guests, Barrie Schwortz, I'll just let you start with what you do. What is the Shroud of Turin?
Well, the Shroud of Turin is a 14.5 foot long, 3.5 foot wide linen sheet that bears the image of a beaten, scourged, crucified, speared, crowned with a crown of thorns man that many people believe to be the burial shroud of Jesus. The one thing I will correct is, I would like to correct is that I'm not the first photographer to make photographs of the shroud, but I was a member of the only scientific team ever given permission to do an in-depth examination of the shroud in 1978. We spent 5 days and nights around the clock examining the shroud, gathering data from the cloth, and then after we completed that, we spent the next 3 years reducing the data, writing it into scientific papers, and it's all been published into peer-reviewed scientific journals of the highest caliber. And so we created, in effect, the first true scientific database of information about the shroud. As I said, many people believe the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. From a Christian perspective, Christians interpret the information on the shroud to believe that this proves the death of Jesus. The Muslim point of view looks at the same data and believes that this shows that he was not dead. So I'm Jewish, so I'm sort of in between and don't really have a horse in the race, as they say. And perhaps that's why when they asked me to be on the team, I was very hesitant. But I realized some years later that in God's wisdom, who better than a man who's a skeptic, who has no emotional attachment or even that much of an interest initially in being a part of this, who better than that man to eventually, by the science, be convinced? Took 20 years, but at the end of that period of time, I realized that the public doesn't read scientific journals, especially back in the days before the internet. And so I felt that I was obligated to take all this information that I've been so privileged to collect and to make it available to everyone. So I built the first website on the Shroud of Turin. We're almost 20 years old, shroud.com.
Interesting. A lot of work that went into that. If I come to Arif Khan Sahib, Barrie Schwortz rightly mentioned the background to this shroud. It's something that's related to millions of people around the world because the Jewish people, have direct contact with it, which means that they try to crucify Jesus, and the Christians obviously believing in Jesus are holding him very high in their faith, and of course the Muslims believing in all the prophets of God also regard Jesus as a holy man. So what role does this shroud play in religious terms, in these having these three religions in perspective?
So I would say clearly it plays the strongest role traditionally towards the Christians. There's been many people recently who have debated whether Jesus even existed as a historical figure. It might sound very strange to hear that, but there are those who have said there are limited references to him outside the Old Testament, the New Testament. So, as a Muslim, someone who clearly believes in Jesus or Hazrat Isa, it's a very strange thing to even hear people saying there was no Jesus. You get the skeptics going as far as saying he never existed. So from that perspective, the shroud gives you a visual evidence, if you like, a documented artifact that shows a description very close to the New Testament narrative about Jesus' punishment, incredibly close to that. You can see a real parallels between the description of the way he was punished, tortured, and executed. From a Jewish perspective, I guess they don't have that much interest in the shroud as a cloth. Jesus was one of many who claimed to be Messiah. As far as their perspective was concerned, he was put to death and that was the end of the story. A lot of the other Sunni Muslims or other Muslims often have the viewpoint that Jesus was never even placed on the cross. He was either lifted up or someone else was placed. So it's interesting that the Ahmadi Muslims in particular are the ones who have a real interest in this cloth. We believe it was, we believe Jesus was put on a cross. We believe he survived the crucifixion. So from that perspective, often when you talk to others about the crucifixion, it becomes about discussions on this gospel or that gospel, or you're discussing about very fine, minute details. But what the shroud can potentially do is give us an actual artifact, an eyewitness potentially to the events of the crucifixion.
Yeah, exactly. Like we were saying, if history proves, books of scripture prove that Jesus existed, the Jewish people lived with him, right, and not believing in him as a Messiah, put him on the cross, right? Even the Quran testifies to this, that Jesus was put on the cross. There should be no doubt about that. But then the shroud, the role that the shroud plays, I believe, is what happened afterwards. We know that there are blood stains on the shroud. Can you tell us more about that? How is it connected?
What's depicted on the shroud is so forensically accurate. And it's not my opinion. Being a photographer, I'm not a forensic expert, but there have been quite a number of forensic experts that have been in direct examination of the cloth and in the wounds particularly. And we have blood stains that, according to the forensic experts, could only have occurred by physical contact between the cloth and the body, with such accuracy that they couldn't have been painted or added somehow later. And I think that aside from that, the crucifixion wounds, we cannot see the inside of the hands because of the way the body has been laid. We can only see the back of the hand, the exit wound from the crucifixion nails. We see the crucifixion blood stains and wounds in the feet. But there's been a debate, particularly mostly amongst the forensic experts. Did they use one nail to nail both feet, or one nail for each foot? I think my Christian brothers and sisters like the idea of the three, particularly my Catholic friends, because it sort of ties to the Trinity, which is essential to their faith. But the remains of two different crucifixion victims have been found, each with a nail through the side of the ankle, implying that there were probably four. But when it comes down to the details of this, I always say, well, look, who cares whether it was 3 or 4? Look what they did to him. Yeah, exactly. Isn't that what it's about? Not so much about how many nails or which nerve might have been touched. Yeah. But when science gets involved, which they now have, you always have differences of opinion. There are forensic pathologists who say there's proof that the man on the shroud is alive. I think Professor Bonte in Germany. And so it's not just the Muslims who have that belief. There are many others. Kirsten and Gruber, who have written books that, very much like the book the founder of the Ahmadiyya community had written. He was the first one to make that statement. I believe.
To bring you back again, I'll have to come back to you, Barrie Schwortz. The role you played, you mentioned 1978, being part of that first team. Seeing that shroud for the first time, it must have been very difficult, I know, through history, even to allow access to that shroud. So what role did your team play in 1978 in taking pictures of that shroud?
It was far more than just taking pictures, Abdullah. We were given a potential opportunity to examine it, so we spent 17 months, a team of about 32 total scientists, or photographers and technicians. And 24 of us were granted the permission ultimately to go to Turin and perform the first in-depth scientific examination that had ever been done on the cloth. Before I became directly involved, when they asked me to be a participant, I was hoping to find some information about it just to give me a sense of, even if I wanted to be involved, because I'm Jewish, I didn't have any emotional attachment. But in the end, that may have been a great advantage for me. So I could look at it without any kind of emotional bias. And I don't mean that in a negative way. If someone's raised a Christian, you're certainly going to have that emotional attachment to Jesus that I didn't have. I knew about him. I knew he was Jewish, but I didn't really know much else. So our team was given this permission. We spent 17 months planning our experiments, and we went and performed the most extensive series of non-destructive tests, meaning we caused no harm to the cloth. And we went through 5 days and nights without stopping, performing everything from chemistry, physics, spectral analysis, special types of scientific photography, ultraviolet fluorescence. And so what we did was we didn't have time to make a decision there. We didn't want to. We wanted to collect as much as we could in 5 days and nights, knowing that ultimately then we could spend however long afterwards to review the data and go through it and try and make some determinations. Ultimately, took 3 years. At the end of 3 years, our work was published in a series of about 24 scientific papers in very highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. And we created, in essence, the first scientific database about the shroud. And interestingly enough, since no one else has been given that permission since, it forms the basis of what almost every bit of research that goes on today is still based on the data we gathered in 1978.
Exactly. That's quite impressive to hear that happening in 1978. But Arif Khan, you know, as a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, like Barrie Schwortz himself mentioned, that the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community wrote with so much conviction based on the teachings of the Holy Quran and through divine revelation that God Almighty informed him that in fact that, in particular about that shroud, how impressed are you that science is able to prove in 1978, years after the advent of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad as the promised Messiah of the age, proving and testifying the fact that the man in that shroud was actually Jesus? How does it, how you...
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, definitely. So you're absolutely right that, you know, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam went out, made a very bold claim about the survival of the crucifixion a very long time ago, and also the journey across Afghanistan and into Kashmir, and he was the first person to really stitch that whole story together in one coherent piece. We have had people who talked about the Kashmir bit separately, but not someone who had explained the crucifixion events in that detail. And obviously in the position he was in, claiming to be a prophet, claiming, you know, founding a community, once you make a statement like that, it's absolutely, you know, very important, and it goes out on a, you're out on a limb almost, making a statement like that, and he made it with absolute conviction that, you know, this is what's been revealed to me as well. So it is impressive to see how that testament, you know, has stayed the length of time. And you'll see more recent analysis, as Barrie mentioned, there's Holger Kirsten who wrote Jesus Lived in India, and these other books as well on this subject, but they all reference back to Hazrat Masih Maud's work from 1890s or the late 19th century, which was a long time ago with no access, etc. Another interesting thing that some people have mentioned on is that, you know, we have photos of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam claiming to be a prophet. And it's interesting that if the shroud is, you know, an actual absolute representation, not something drawn, something representation, it means that's another prophet potentially we have an image of. And it's interesting that those are the only two potential people claiming prophethood for which we have some likeness or an image, which is another interesting similarity.
Exactly. Barrie Schwortz, if you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing, and because you mentioned proving this was Jesus. Now, that's a touchy subject from a scientific point of view, because to prove who this man was to a scientific certainty, we would need to have some definitive evidence besides the circumstantial evidence that all is overwhelmingly pointing in that direction. But when you prove something to a scientific certainty, it's a much higher standard. And today, of course, we all know about DNA analysis, and I get that question frequently. And I always say to people, remember, it's comparative analysis. Yeah. So if anyone has the DNA of Jesus, I wish they would come forward. Perhaps then we might be able to prove it. Yeah. But since we don't, we can only look at the other evidence. And the other problem with DNA, since I brought that up, that cloth has been handled for centuries. Everyone who's touched it, breathed on it, repaired it, leaned over it, prayed near it, has shed their DNA onto it as well. And in 2002, they did a restoration of the shroud, and one woman from Switzerland was given the opportunity to remove the patches that had been sewn in to repair some fire damage in the 1500s. She removed the patches, she scraped away the charred areas around the burns, she removed the backing sheet, they steamed it to get rid of the wrinkles, they scraped away the char, as I said. She didn't have gloves, hairnet, mask, or protective clothing, and she handled it for 32 days. So I'm afraid now if we were to do a DNA analysis, we'd find the man of the shroud is actually a Swiss woman.
It don't turn out to be that way. That's, again, science. Thank you for enlightening us again on that subject matter. But coming again, knowing the importance of this piece of cloth, but looking at the background behind it, knowing about the Jewish law, that it quite clearly says that if someone claims to be from God and the person is not from God, is one of those people that are put on the cross. So, Barrie Schwortz, we're talking about narrowing the line now, because like you were saying, it could have been anyone, but how many lines do we see directing us towards that time that it could be Jesus, about the person could be a claimant of a prophet, and was anyone just wrapped up in that way? And we also know through history that some ointment was applied on the body of Jesus. So is there any indication towards that, the time and the person?
I think the time, and from my perspective, I think that the time is evident based on just the manufacture of the cloth. Was made in the ancient method, which would have put it back in near the 1st century. The timing of it beyond that is difficult, other than the fact that if you look in the Old Testament, in the Torah, men of high stature were required to be buried in pure linen raiments. In the New Testament, it talks about a cloth being there when the tomb was open, the body was gone. But the cloth remained, and also a second cloth folded and separate from the other. Jewish law requires that anything that has blood on it, whether it's the burial shroud or the face cloth, which the other cloth would have been, must be buried with the body. So all of that points to an authentic 1st century Jewish burial. Although when my father passed away about 15 years ago, he was buried in a shroud very similar to the Shroud of Turin. So even that tradition continues on, at least amongst the Orthodox Jewish folks. So I think that there's a lot that points to it, but once again, proving something, when you say prove, remember I learned my science discipline from the scientists on our team that were top-notch, and so they had very high standards.
They had to be critical. They couldn't just make conclusions like that.
So it sort of rubbed off on me. So I always try and clarify that when we say prove, but there's another way to prove things, and that's the way the legal systems work, both here in the United Kingdom and even in the United States, that you can take and accumulate circumstantial evidence, powerful circumstantial evidence, and frankly, every bit of that evidence, including all the data that we gathered, all points to this being the real thing and an authentic 1st century burial. And if that's the case, think about this, that throughout history, the Romans crucified many, many people. They may have speared many in the side or scourged many, but only one man had a crown of thorns placed on his head, and this man has stains, blood stains across his entire scalp. And so by the process of, I often quote Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, that if you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. And ultimately, that's what led me to finally conclude this had to be real, and it took 20 years after I held it before I reached that conclusion. So I think that there's a preponderance of evidence that supports that conclusion, but that's not absolute. If you're looking at it from a scientific point of view, there's always the possibility. And remember this, human beings are involved in the interpretation of the data. You and I could look at the same evidence, and you might see it one way and I might see it another, and that's natural, that's human. So the interpretations of either side, because of course here I am at a Muslim community, for the first time I might add, ever having this opportunity, and I understand the differences between the Muslim faith and the Christian faith when it comes to Jesus, and whether he was alive or not. And although I personally, and I'm going to state this categorically, that I personally lean towards him being dead, but remember, that's the preponderance of evidence. That's not to an absolute scientific certainty.
Exactly.
So I am open, and I am willing to understand and accept both points of views. And being Jewish, my faith isn't incumbent on either point of view. That's why I can remain neutral, look at both points of view, and accept and respect both positions.
Again, Arif Khan Saab, coming back to you, we look at the evidences from the books through history We know that Jesus was put on the cross, that a thorn was put on his head, he was pierced on the side, an ointment was applied on him, and even in the Bible says after crucifixion, he even met his companions and he ate with them, and he was telling them that he was, physical, and the parts of the body that were bleeding, thorns on the head, and all these evidences. What role do they play as an Ahmadi Muslim? Again?
Point to the authenticity of the cross, absolutely. So we've been very fortunate this year to have an excellent exhibition from Pam Moon, who's based in the UK. She's the one who's provided us with this life-size exhibition, and it documents exactly how the New Testament describes the punishment and the way Jesus was, executed effectively and punished. Don't also forget that this cloth has been preserved in history. Yeah. So if it belonged to some other person, why would they be preserving this specific cloth as well? It has all the characteristics we would look for, and it matches the gospel descriptions closely, and it's been preserved over a period of time. It all points to Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd like to tell a quick little story about my little Jewish mother, may she rest in peace. Born in Poland, emigrated to the United States as a child, so she's not highly educated. When she heard my first lecture about 10 or 15 years ago in person about the shroud, we were driving home afterwards. She was quiet, and when a mother is quiet on something, it makes me nervous. You could be afraid. And she was very silent. So I finally turned to her. I was wondering what she thought. And so I said, "Mother, what do you think?" And she said, "Well, of course, it's authentic. This is a little Jewish lady." So now I'm shocked. "Why do you say that, Mother?" She said, "Because they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it belonged to anybody else. It wouldn't have mattered."
Yeah.
So in her own way, I kind of laughed at the time. But think about this. Jewish law forbids this to come out of the tomb. It's got blood on it. So whoever rescued this piece of cloth from that tomb put themselves at serious risk of perhaps their own death for rescuing something. And look, both the Jewish and the Muslim faith forbid any kind of depictions of God, and yet this has an image on it. So they were doubly at risk. But they did and rescued it. And that's why I think the earliest history of it is so obscure, because it would have put them perhaps at risk of death, or worse yet, that the iconoclasts, those who were looking to destroy Christian relics, would have destroyed it had they found it. So they had to hide it for, I believe, probably about 285 years, when the first depiction of Jesus looking like the man of the shroud comes into view in the Domitia catacombs in Rome. So there's so much evidence. People say, "What one thing was it that convinced you?" And the only answer I can give is all of the above.
All of the above. That's quite interesting. You've heard it from Barrie Schwortz, a professional who was in the first team that had access to this Shroud of Turin. We've heard historical evidences from the Bible itself. The founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, clearly stating that this man on the shroud is Jesus himself. And even the supreme head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the current leader, even went to Turin and he visited this shroud. We're happy to have you, Barrie Schwortz, and we welcome you, which is something I should have done in the beginning, to our annual gathering of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We would love to hear more, but time has not permitted us, and I will go for a short break. Please remain seated and enjoy the rest of the proceedings.